So we're talking about the battle of the big three, that is Ford, Chevy, and Dodge, and their famous V8 engines. So if each of these three engines walked into a bar, the Ford would be the lab coat, always trying to reinvent the wheel. The modular engines, the side valve engines, the EcoBoost, they are the ones that are continually trying to reinvent the wheel. Chevy is sort of the old school Back to the Future. If a Chevy vehicle was a actor, it would be Michael J. Fox. Keep going back in time to 1955 and bringing back the famous small block V8. Now, Dodge, on the other hand, is kind of a jack of all trades. They're sort of that old school Patrick Swayze. They got the pushrod engine, but they got those new school dance moves with the Hemi cylinder heads. So all three engines sort of have their advantages, but let's talk about the core values of each company. So Ford is started with the side valve engine, which was essentially the first mass-produced V8 engine and the first modern assembly line. Chevy is known mainly for their marketing and branding of all their different brands, 6 brands in total, and the famous small block V8. Now, when all these engines, if you compare them side by side, there's really some specific differences. So the Hemi is sort of the best blend of old school and new school, because you got the old school pushrod engines, but when they redid the Hemi from the Magnum engine, they switched it to an aluminum block and aluminum heads, whereas the Magnum was a iron block, and it had combustion chambers that weren't the Hemi combustion chambers. Now, when Ford first started out in the 50s after World War II, they were trying to compete with all these different brands that Chevy had. So what they decided to do is have the engine families, because they couldn't rest on the laurels of the side valve flathead V8 anymore. Chevy had gotten too big, so they decided to come out with engine families. They basically had the FE engines, they had the Cleveland engines, they had the Windsor engines, the small block engines, and then Dodge during this whole period was kind of doing a mix of both of what Chevy and Ford were doing. They were doing the pushrod engines, but they were getting more creative with their cylinder head design. So the Hemi cylinder head basically was famous in NASCAR, and that's when Ford really got into the overhead cam technology, the single overhead cam with the camera. So as all three companies sort of started to advance the technologies, Chevy is probably the most old school. They stuck with the pushrod engines for their V8s, V6s, and even in their 4 cylinders. They're pretty much primarily a pushrod company. Hemi with the Dodge, they switched the cylinder heads, but with Ford, they're the ones to really do single overhead cam and overhead cam technology.